Hi and welcome to the video. Even though Sony's flagship camera, the A1, is already more than 3 years old, I think it still has some very impressive specs with the 30 frames per second, 50 megapixel stacked sensor, a very large and bright viewfinder with a nice resolution, a highly customizable camera, excellent autofocus, many video features. So I was kind of eager to test the camera and see how well it holds up against an R5, Z9 or other competitors. Sony was kind enough to lend me this camera for around 10 days in combination with the 400mm f2.8 that I have used with both the 1.4 and 2x extender for wildlife photography. And in this video I want to share my findings, what I think about this camera and whether it's still worth buying it now. Let's start with the body and the handling of the camera, and here I need to say some things that I will point out are just my findings, my impressions. They are of course subjective. I just want to compare them a bit to the other cameras that I'm more used to when taking pictures, namely the Z9 and the Canon R5. First of all, as you would expect from a camera of this class, it has several buttons and dials that you can customize, and you can customize them actually much more than Canon and also the Nikon. Basically, you can put almost every function on every button, and I found this very useful because especially on Canon I was sometimes a bit limited and I wish I could also assign this specific function to that button, but for whatever reason it is not possible. Sony gives us much more freedom here, which I definitely appreciate. You can see that the body overall is a bit more boxy, I would say, than Canon bodies especially, or even Nikons that tend to be a little bit rounder. And while I don't care so much about the look, I need to say that at least for my hands, I feel the Nikon Z8 or Z9 or the Canon R5 and especially R3 are somehow more comfortable to my hands for holding for an extended period of time. But again, this totally comes down to personal preference. One thing that I really liked about using the camera was that it has 4 dials here on kind of the right side of the camera. So this means, like my Canon, I can put one for shutter speed, one for ISO and one for aperture. But I also have a 4th one for the exposure compensation. And this is just interesting because usually I shoot manual mode, so I don't need the exposure compensation. But there are some very rare situations where I like to put the ISO on automatic, and then it's nice to have a dedicated dial just for the exposure compensation. On top here we have the mode dial, and with this has like 3 different custom modes, 1, 2 and 3. And what I noticed, what is a bit different than with Canon and Nikon, is that here basically every time you change something, you switch to another custom mode and you change back, it reverts to the original settings that you registered in the beginning. I don't know if I overlooked a setting here, but I think this is the case how Sony handles it. With Nikon it's the opposite, so basically if you made some changes, you switch to another mode and you switch back. As far as I know, the changes are updated, and with Canon you can actually choose which behavior you want, and I wish that here with the Sony, where you can customize so many things, that this would also be an option to choose. The viewfinder has a high resolution of around 9.4 million dots and a big magnification of 0.9, and it is blackout free, which is really nice when tracking especially more erratic birds in flight. On the back we have a 3-inch monitor that can tilt out and up and down. The problem I had here in some occasions was when I was doing some vertical shooting and I wanted to shoot from a lower angle. There is no way that you can tilt the monitor like upwards in a vertical position, so that was a bit limiting. And if I would like to film myself, there is no way to kind of put the monitor out that I see myself like as I'm doing it right now with my Canon R5. And Sony has in the new A9 Mark III a much more sophisticated LCD screen that can rotate in basically every direction you want. On the side here we have the card slots with dual SD/CF Express Type A cards. So it's actually quite convenient. You can put either the fast CF Express Type A cards in here or the SD cards. So you just have 2 slots, so either 2x SD, 2x CF Express, or 1 CF Express, 1 SD. The advantage is, of course, the flexibility you get. The disadvantage is the CF Express Type A that this A1 uses are more expensive and slower than the counterpart that Nikon and Canon are using, and this is the CF Express Type B. Before we move to the image quality, just a few more things that I noticed when using the camera. First of all, the ability to use or to display zebras when shooting, I found it very handy. Especially when you're a bit more new to a camera and you're not 100% sure or don't want to look too much on the histogram. It's very nice if you directly see which areas of the image will be overexposed, and kind of obviously you can set different zebras kind of presets or different zebra values, and you can toggle between them if needed. I just kept them at the same value for the whole time, but this might be interesting that you can use a different one for video and for photography. What I also noticed is when closing the aperture, you actually see the depth of field preview automatically. With Canon and Nikon, you kind of need to press a dedicated button, like the depth of field button, or however this is called, to see. Here you don't. I was always assuming that this has a negative impact on autofocus. I did just some very quick testing, like at f18 or f20 compared to f2.8, and the autofocus seems to react almost the same. So this was actually kind of cool that you see this preview automatically without needing to press another button. On the other hand, one function that I kind of missed is when I used the 400mm 2.8, I put in the 1.4 extender, the maximum aperture drops to f4, and then the image got darker. On the Canon and Nikon, what they do is usually they just increase the ISO by 1 stop to compensate for this loss of light. They increase the ISO by 2 stops if you add the 2x extender, or also if you use a zoom that has a variable aperture like the 100 to 400mm, or in case of Canon the 100 to 500. The ISO also change depending on how you zoom, if the aperture changes there, and I wish Sony would kind of add this via firmware as well. I mostly use this camera with the battery grip. I like the way that with Sony we actually have more flexibility with the flagship model, that you can also use it without the battery grip and you have a more compact camera, because the battery grip can sometimes be in the way if you want to get really low, and of course it makes the camera a bit heavier. On the other hand, I felt like it felt a bit smaller in my hand than my R5 somehow. It definitely is smaller than the Z8. So for here I was quite happy for most of the time using the battery grip, but I was also not doing crazy hikes or doing a lot of low angle shooting. And the advantage of using the battery grip is obviously that you have more battery capacity. You have 2 batteries that you can put in, and the nice thing is it really uses one battery completely empty and then starts using the second one, so you can then just charge the first one. One thing I kind of missed a bit on the battery grip was that we don't have the exposure compensation dial. So we have these 2 dials here, but not the one that I used for the aperture. This I would like to reach like this, which is still feasible, but the exposure compensation, I really need to go back to the horizontal layout to change that one. And I don't know if this is a problem with the model that I have here, but the joystick feels different in the battery grip than in the actual camera. The one in the battery grip feels less precise, and I don't feel so well if I click in the middle. So that's just a small complaint about the battery grip, but overall I was still happy to have it. Let's have a look at the image quality. I need to say here I didn't do any studio comparison. I was taking over 10,000 pictures in the field. I had a look at the pictures at different ISOs, also backlit situations, and I just want to draw my conclusion based on this. So this is a bit more an empirical test, or just me telling my experiences. So the 50 megapixel sensors delivers really a lot of detail, and the noise levels were also quite low. I was actually surprised. I had the feeling it was pretty much on par with my Canon R5, and especially in the higher ISO it was better than the Z8 or Z9, but also not by so much that it would make a dramatic difference. But I felt like I needed to run DxO Puro a bit less here than I did on the Nikon cameras. Many people also like to discuss apparently about the different color science or colors of Sony, Nikon and Canon, and here I actually felt that the Sony A1 was kind of between the Canon R5 and the Nikon Z8 or Z9. So the Canon generally have a bit more warmer, more orangey reddish colors. The Nikon's a bit more blue and greenish colors. And you can see this clearly if you have a lot of green in the picture, or if you shoot backlit, where the Canon just gives more warmer tones that I actually prefer. But I never had problems bringing the Nikon colors to what I actually wanted. I felt that Sony was really a bit in between, gave quite neutral colors, and overall I was very happy and didn't need to tweak the colors too much. I was very curious to see how the autofocus on the Sony A1 would perform, and when I took it out for the first time to take some pictures of swallows in flight, I was really pleasantly surprised how good the autofocus is. I felt it was just detecting the subject better and also tracking it better than my Canon R5 is doing, or than a Nikon Z8 or Z9 is doing. It's not a day and night difference, but I just felt this one was really a bit more solid. And also when I shot in a bit more tricky backlit scenarios, I was very happy with the performance of the A1. I think the Nikons are also doing great there, but especially the A1 is definitely a lot better in backlit than the Canon R5 that is sometimes get a bit distracted by like some bokeh that you have in the water, and this one was much more constant. The way the autofocus works and can be customized is a bit different than Nikon or Canon, so it just takes a bit of time to realize what are the most important modes, how you can switch quickly between them. I also set like the tracking on one of the buttons specifically, another button I programmed to change the autofocus field, another button I used to change between the different subject detection modes. So almost all the buttons that I configured on the camera were actually evolving around the autofocus, and in the end I just need to say the results were very good. I also was taking some pictures of squirrels and alpine ibex, and I was also quite happy with the autofocus performance. I felt that with bird it worked better than with mammals, but this was the case for all mirrorless cameras that I used so far. What is just important is that unlike the Canon R5 or R3, the Sony cannot automatically switch between like animal detection and bird detection autofocus, so you manually need to tell the camera what it should look for. This is a bit similar than what the Z8 and Z9 are doing, so I put basically the toggle between these birds and mammals on one button, and if you forget it, it's not the end of the world. From my experience, usually it still picks up the subject, but it might take a bit longer to pick it up. It's not as accurate, and sometimes it goes on the wrong body part. So I had it like once or twice that I accidentally was in the bird detection mode, and I wanted to take a picture of an ibex, and then it just went on the nose instead of on the eye, or once it went on the ear instead of the eye. This can still happen if you're in the proper mode, but I felt it was much more reliable when I was in the proper mode, and the same the other way around. I was also taking some bird in flight pictures of the alpine choughs because I was taking pictures of ibex. I saw an alpine chough flying by. I just moved to the alpine chough without thinking about switching the AF mode, and it worked. It would have worked a bit better, and it would have, from my experience, gone quicker directly to the head instead of on the whole body if I would have been in the proper mode. Maybe Sony finds a way to automatically make them detect both subjects, but I don't know if this is what it takes to deliver this really good autofocus performance, then I'm also happy with that. If you shoot in uncompressed RAW, the camera can shoot up to 20 frames per second. If you switch to the compressed RAW, you get up to 30 frames per second. And I was very happy with the image quality in the compressed RAW. Actually, I also shot the Nikon Z8, Z9, the Canon R5. I shoot all of them in the compressed RAW setting. And I did the same here. And it's really nice in some situations to have these 30 frames per second. Not so much with mammals, but especially with birds in flight or birds that are fighting. I just feel you have more options. When I was taking pictures of the starlings and swallows in the rain, I felt that I have more options, because sometimes the position of the wing might not be good. Maybe the bird has the eye closed for a split second just because it was raining so much. You could have raindrops instead exactly in front of the head. So here 30 frames per second just gave me a bit more options to look for. And I felt that the buffer was still lasting quite long. In fact, in the beginning, unfortunately, I only had SD cards, and I was afraid that this would slow down the camera a lot. Well, it did slow down, but not as bad as I thought. So for swallows in flight, it was actually not a problem with SD cards, because usually I find the swallow, I track it, I make a burst for like maybe 1 second of these 30 frames, and then I let go and I wait for the next swallow to appear. So no problem for the buffer. When I had some grebes that were kind of interacting for each other, these kind of scenes were taking longer. Or I had one grip that was like catching a fish and trying to eat it, and he also succeeded in eating it. And there I have action for a bit longer, and I'm happy to have a deeper buffer. So there the CF Express cards were really welcome. By the way, if you want to learn more about how I took the pictures of the crested grebe, please subscribe to the channel. I'm editing a video about that at the moment. So I wanted to do some comparisons with SD and CF Express cards to see how deep the buffer is or how large the buffer is. And I decided to not actually test how many pictures you can take until you hit the buffer, but I tested how many pictures can you take in 20 seconds. Because I found that it really depends on the camera brand how a camera reacts after the buffer is hit. There is some camera brands that clear away the buffer quite quick, and they allow you to continue a quite fast shooting rate, whereas other cameras, once they hit the buffer, they are basically not reacting anymore for several seconds. So I pressed down the shutter for 20 seconds with 30 frames per second set, so theoretically it would be possible to take 600 frames in this 20 seconds. With the SD card I got 225 pictures, so this corresponds to 11 frames per second on average. Not too bad actually, but with the CF Express card I managed to get 400 pictures, which is 20 frames per second average. So this means in the beginning I had my 30 frames per second for several seconds, and then it dropped to, I don't know if it was 8 or 12 frames per second, but it continued with this pace for quite a while, which is quite nice because you can still take some pictures. With my R5 it's unfortunately a bit like, once I hit the buffer there is a quick break of maybe 1 or 2 seconds that feels like eternity because it doesn't take any pictures anymore, and then it continues again. And I prefer this a bit smoother, continuous shooting that the Sony here delivers. The camera is of course also very capable of taking videos. It's even written here on the side that it supports up to 8K. I need to say I did not shoot 8K. I also don't use this feature with the Z9, Z8 or R5. I often shoot 4K 120 frames per second because then I can like slow the action down and do nice slow motions. And I use this here a lot as well, and I was positively surprised that this is still possible with SD cards. This doesn't work with Canon. Maybe it's a different codec, I don't know. But here this works also with SD cards. And the other thing I enjoyed compared to Canon is that you have audio if you shoot 120 frames per second. Of course, if you do a slow motion, the audio will sound super weird and you will probably not use it. But it just means I have like slow motion and normal video in once. I can just shoot a clip. If I want to have the bird singing with the sound, I play it back in normal speed. If I want to put some music and just want to see the bird moving the beak a bit slowly, shaking its feathers, then I can use the slow motion. On the Canon, I always need to do 2 video clips, one for the song basically and one for the slow motion. So this is definitely done much nicer with the Sony cameras, and by the way Nikon as well. One thing that is not amazing is that in the video mode this camera doesn't have bird eye detection or animal eye detection, so you basically manually need to set the tracking point in the camera. It works as well. Actually I was thinking it would be a bigger problem, but it was okay-ish. What I also realized is that the image stabilization with these long lenses in the video mode is not the best. So I just felt with my R5 and RF600 I got a more stable image, but anyway, neither the Sony or the Canon came close to what Nikon delivers with the Z8 and Z9 in video mode. It's really crazy that you can with more than 1000mm still handheld video and it looks very stable. So once again, it depends completely on what you plan to do. If you don't shoot handheld video, then this point is completely irrelevant for you. If you shoot a lot of handheld video with long super telephoto lenses, be aware that the stabilization in this camera is not the best. So after taking more than 10,000 pictures with the Sony A1, do I think that this is currently the best camera for taking photos of birds and other wildlife? Yes. I think actually it is. It offers 30 frames per second at 50 megapixel. It has, in my opinion, the best autofocus of the cameras that I have used so far. Disclaimer here, for example, I did not use the A9 Mark III from Sony yet. But of the ones that I tested, I felt that this is the best one. And it's the same with the frames per second. The Nikon Z8, Z9 only do 20, which is still plenty fast, but in some occasions I was happy to have the 30 frames per second. I think if you are more a hybrid shooter, then a Z8 or Z9 might be a bit more interesting, because in terms of video, I feel they are more modern cameras and they do some things better than the Sony A1. But if you are a pure photographer, or really photography is your main goal, then I feel like this is really still amazing, even if it's older than 3 years. One thing where I'm a bit surprised is that the camera is still priced quite high. In Europe, it's around 7,300 euros. As I said, in my opinion, for wildlife photography, it is the best camera on the market now, from what I have tested. But I feel like for these last few percent compared to a Z8, Z9 or R5, you pay quite a lot of money. And here, of course, everybody needs to decide for his, her own if this is worth it or not. I hope you enjoyed my kind of first Sony review. Thanks to Sony Switzerland for letting me borrow the camera. And if you would be curious to see more Sony reviews in the coming month, then please let me know exactly which model you would be interested in me doing a review. I am talking about cameras and of course also lenses.